I learned from one of my colleagues whom I met in 1979, 1980. His name is Adrian Gross. He died in 1992. But when he came to EPA, he had already put 20 years of service with the Federal Drug Administration. Adrian was a pathologist. He had gotten his education in Canada and the United States. He had a doctor's degree. And he had 20 years of experience as a pathologist and also as a lab inspector. He would go with FDA and check the laboratories that were doing the studies for the government. And one of his explorations with the laboratories, he discovered, literally speaking, the greatest fraud in American history. There was a laboratory by the name of Industrial Biotest Laboratory outside of Chicago that for 25 years would test chemicals coming out of state governments, out of chemical industry, of course, and sometimes the federal government. And most of the big chemicals, and drugs, by the way, not just chemicals, pesticides, but drugs, they had tested. So by the time that Adrian discovered this fraud in 1976, they were testing 40% of all the chemicals and drugs in this country. So you're talking about huge amounts of stuff. And he told me that he discovered about this because once one of the laboratories gave him a piece of paper. And he said, I saw all these numbers written very nicely with the same pencil, the same neatly clean piece of paper out of the laboratory. He said it's out of the question. You know, people that work in the laboratory, they're not that careful, so they make mistakes, whatever. And he said that immediately sparked in my mind something was not correct, quite right. So he and his colleagues did a serious inspection and they discovered the literally filthy environment of that laboratory. For instance, you do a study with rats, and a rat develop growth or some cancer. They would take the animal, dispose it, and then replace it with a new animal. They would say do 10 months, and then they would replace another 10 months with fake numbers, that sort of thing. It was just a horrible mess. So what to do? This is 1976. And it took down to 1983 for the government to shut down this laboratory. 76, 83. And not only that, but the major chemical industry organizations like Monsanto had its own man right in the laboratory. So think of the implications. But the Carter administration ordered EPA to just simply focus on the laboratory and leave the big fish alone. That's what they did. So they eventually shut it down after a lengthy trial in Chicago, and that was it. But then what do you do with the chemicals that had already been approved on the basis of this criminal affair? What to do? So the government came up with the excuse that, you know, we have complementary studies, so don't worry about it. But then what are the complementary studies? And then, of course, they asked the companies to repeat their studies. That takes time, another 2 years, another 4 years. Meanwhile, your food goes contaminated with this stuff, and you kept eating the food. And of course, when this came into the fore, the New York Times had a couple of articles. Senator Kennedy, in his subcommittee, he had some hearings, but really nothing much happened or changed. And Kennedy's subcommittee published a wonderful report, which I cite in this book, critical, very critical of EPA and so on. But regrettably, they didn't follow up to reform the system that allowed this corruption to take place. And what do I mean by this? The director of EPA, that is the administrator, is appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, and then his deputies are also political appointees by the president. Okay? And then these political appointees, they always look at the future. Who is going to employ me after the 4 years are over? Or 8 years if the president gets elected twice. So they are very gentle to the industry that they're supposed to regulate. So they do favors for them. And then if they're not willing to do the favors for them, then the chemical industry, let's say big corporation X, goes to the White House, or they go to Congress, and the congressman picks the phone up, and he calls up a director of the, and he said, look, I have a product that I have requested to be looked at by you. How about if you send me a report in 2 weeks? And what are you going to say? No? After all, these are the guys that give you the budget, and they control you. So the system is designed to do these corrupt practices, to approve this stuff without really scientific study that it's okay. And then there's the law itself. The law itself, which is a 1940s law, it was revived pretty sporadically in 1972, 82, and so on. The so-called Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act has a Section 18, for instance. Section 18 is, they call it for emergency exceptions. So let's say big farmers in the state of New York or the state of California, they decide they want a new chemical which has never been tested, and they go to the governor of the state. They say, look, governor, we need to have this because, you know, we have an infestation of this and the chemical we use are not good enough, so we need this. So the governor of the state writes a letter to EPA and says, look, my state needs this chemical for, say, 3 years. And usually EPA approves it. So here it is. They are using a completely untested chemical for 3 years all over California, let's say. Or California and Arizona, or California and Nevada. Huge expanses of land and area. And they use it for extended periods of time. And I remember in 1983, the EPA itself studied this phenomenon, and they found that in the period, for instance, from Jimmy Carter to 1983, the number of exceptions they had allowed had jumped several 100%. So the chemical industry is taking advantage of the very law that exists in the books to use untested chemicals. And what I said about the IBT, you have that IBT example puts into question the credibility of what we actually get in.